Okay, so you want to really get down into the weeds of this thing, right? I think we all do sometimes, and you're in the right place.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for.
So today we're diving into the Battle of Thomas Creek, and we're basing this deep dive on information from the battleofthomascreek.pdf.
Excellent source.
Yeah, so if you think you know everything about the Revolutionary War, think again.
Oh, yeah.
Because this one
Always something new.
often gets overlooked. It's
Totally discovered.
kind of a hidden gem in the overall story
Oh,
for
sure.
war. But it's actually a really significant chapter, particularly when we're talking about the southern colonies.
Absolutely.
So what we really want to do today is figure out the key events and the motivations behind them, and then look at, the lasting effects that this specific battle had within the bigger picture of the revolution.
Right.
So let's set the scene. It's May 1777. We're in northern East Florida, pretty close to what's now Callahan, Florida.
Okay.
And American forces are gearing up for their second attempt to invade British East Florida.
We've already tried this once.
They have.
Interesting.
Now, to really grasp how we ended up at the Battle of Thomas Creek, we've got to rewind a bit and talk about Button Gwinnett.
Okay.
He was the president of Georgia at the time, and
Founding father.
he was
His declaration.
absolutely. He was at his wit's end with all these loyalist raiding parties that were using East Florida as their base of operations.
Makes sense. It was a British stronghold.
It was, and there was one raid in particular that really pushed him over the edge.
Oh, yeah.
This was in February of 1777,
Right.
led by a loyalist by the name of Thomas Brown.
Thomas Brown.
And this raid was bold. It was brazen. It really lit a fire under Gwinnett.
Right.
So he decided, all right, enough is enough. We're launching an expedition. And his goal, nothing short of capturing St. Augustine,
Wow.
the capital of British East Florida.
Bold move.
Very ambitious.
It was, yeah.
But it wasn't just some small-time local operation. General Robert Howe, who was the big guy in charge of the Continental Army's Southern Department, he actually gave this expedition the thumbs up.
Okay, so it had some official backing.
It did. He authorized Colonel Samuel Elbert's 2nd Georgia Regiment to participate.
2nd Georgia.
And even Brigadier General Lachlan McIntosh was supposed to be involved initially.
Okay, so some heavy hitters.
Big
At
names.
least planned to be there.
Right, but here's where things get really messy. And it's a classic case of what can happen in military history when you have
Internal conflict.
internal conflict, right? There was this bitter rivalry between McIntosh and Gwinnett.
Oh, no.
I mean, these guys really couldn't stand each other.
Yeah, you see this a lot,
Oh,
unfortunately.
all the time. And they were completely at odds over every single detail of this invasion, from who should lead it to how they should actually carry it out.
Oh, boy.
And the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Howe and the Georgia legislature finally stepped in and said, okay, look, enough is enough. We're putting Colonel Elbert in command.
Trying to smooth things over.
Hoping to, stabilize the situation, but...
But even before the first shot is fired,
Right.
there's already this big problem.
It really shows you how important leadership and unity are in these kinds of endeavors.
Essentially, it's as important as tactics or anything else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So even before they set foot in Florida, the American effort was already kind of hobbled by this infighting.
Yeah, personalities clashing, egos clashing.
It reminds us that the revolution was fought by real people with, real emotions and ambitions.
Not just names in a history book.
Right, and these things could really affect the outcome on the ground.
Yeah.
So it wasn't all about grand ideals and, perfect strategies.
Complicated
It
business.
was a very human affair.
It is, yeah.
But putting that aside for a moment, let's talk about the plan itself.
Okay, what was the strategy?
With Elbert reluctantly in charge, what were they hoping to achieve? So the Americans, they had cooked up a two-pronged attack.
A classic.
Classic military maneuver.
Divide and conquer kind of approach.
Exactly. So you had Colonel John Baker leading a group of militia cavalry.
Okay.
Somewhere between 100 and 200 men on horseback,
Right.
moving overland.
Okay.
At the same time, you've got Colonel Elbert with the Continental Army troops.
Right.
And they're traveling by a small fleet of boats.
A flotilla.
A flotilla,
Yeah.
making their way through the inland waterways.
So a coordinated movement.
It was. And the plan was to meet up at Sawpit Bluff, which is near the Nassau River.
Okay, so two separate forces converging on a single objective.
Exactly. Now, here's something interesting. We often think of these southern campaigns as being mainly fought by, local militia.
Yeah.
But this invasion force actually involved regiments from multiple colonies.
Oh, really? So it was
It was a bit more of
a combined effort.
a combined effort.
Interesting.
So although a lot of these units never actually made it to where they were supposed to be,
Right.
the initial plan included soldiers from South Carolina and North Carolina alongside the Georgians.
Okay.
We're talking about detachments from the 3rd South Carolina Regiment. You had the Georgia Regiment of Horse Rangers.
Horse Rangers.
Now, those were essentially mounted infantry.
Okay. Kind of a hybrid force?
Yeah, a very common type of unit in the South because of the terrain.
Right, it makes sense.
You know, vast distances, and you needed to be able to move quickly.
Absolutely.
And then you had various other regiments sprinkled in from both North and South Carolina and Georgia.
So a real mix of troops.
It really shows you that this was a regional effort, even though it ultimately didn't pan out.
Right.
So while all this is happening on the American side, what are the British up to?
Well, they can't just be sitting around.
Exactly. They're not just going to, let this invasion happen without a fight.
What are they doing?
So Patrick Tonin, he was the governor of East Florida at the time.
Okay.
He actually had gotten wind of the American plans as early as April.
So he had some lead time.
He was not caught completely off guard.
Good intelligence.
And remember Thomas Brown,
The raider.
the guy who really sparked this whole thing.
Right.
He was still very active along the border
Okay.
with his Loyalist Rangers and a group of Muskogee Indians as allies.
So the British had their own allies in this fight.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very complex and multifaceted conflict.
That sounds like it.
And in fact, it was Brown's forces who first spotted Baker's cavalry as they crossed the St. Mary's River.
Oh, wow. So they were on the lookout.
They were, and this was on May 10th.
Okay.
And they even managed to pinpoint their encampment.
So good scouting on their part.
Very good intelligence gathering. And this is something that's often overlooked in these kinds of stories.
Right.
The role of intelligence networks.
Absolutely crucial.
And the British were very effective at this, particularly with the help of their indigenous allies.
Yeah, they knew the terrain.
They knew the land. They knew how to move undetected.
Make a huge difference.
It does. So it was a big factor in the events that unfolded.
Okay, so the stage is set.
The stage is set.
Tensions are high.
Very high. Now, leading up to the main confrontation at Thomas Creek, there were a couple of incidents that really escalated the situation.
Okay, what happened?
So first, Brown tried to capture a Georgian soldier.
Oh, for interrogation.
For interrogation, he wanted to get some intel.
Classic move.
Classic, but Baker's patrols were too vigilant.
Okay, so that failed.
That one was thwarted. But then on the night of May 14th, going into the 15th, you had the horse theft.
Oh, now that's interesting.
This might seem like a small thing,
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of the war,
Right.
but it had some major consequences.
Okay, also
A group of 15 Indians,
15.
they swiped a bunch of Baker's horses.
Oh, no.
Now, reports differ on exactly how many horses were taken.
Okay.
Some say 40, some say as many as 100.
Wow. Either way, that's significant.
Yeah, it was a big loss for Baker's men.
Yeah, horses are essential.
Vital for their mobility and supplies.
Absolutely.
So they set off in pursuit, and they actually managed to recover the horses in a skirmish.
Okay.
But, and this is crucial, a Chaiha Indian was killed during the fight.
Right.
And the British reported that the body was mutilated by the Georgians.
Oh, that's going to escalate things.
Oh, yeah, it was a powder keg.
Yeah.
Now, we don't know for sure if that specific claim was true.
Right. It's hard to say for certain.
But what we do know is that Governor Tonin himself said that this incident, quote, greatly exasperated the savages, unquote.
So tensions are boiling over.
Oh, yeah. They were furious.
Understandably.
So you can imagine the desire for revenge among the Muskogee allies of the British.
Yeah, this is going to have repercussions.
And this really highlights something that often gets overlooked in the broader narrative of the revolution.
What's that?
The role of indigenous nations.
Right. They were deeply involved.
It wasn't just a conflict between, American colonists and British forces.
A lot more complex.
It was a multi-sided struggle with indigenous groups often caught in the middle.
And forced to choose sides.
Or sometimes forced to choose sides.
Right.
And this incident really underscores the brutal nature of the fighting on the frontier.
Absolutely. This was not a gentleman's war.
No, it was often characterized by, raids and reprisals and a cycle of violence.
A very different kind of warfare.
It was. And these kinds of events could have a huge impact on the overall course of the war.
So how did all of this affect the strategic decisions of both sides?
So Baker, understandably, was getting a little nervous.
Yeah.
Elbert's flotilla was nowhere in sight.
They were late.
They were very late, and he knew the British were now aware of his presence.
Not good.
So he decided to move his men westward to Thomas Creek,
Okay.
which was a tributary of the Nassau River.
A tributary.
He probably figured it was another defensive position.
Right, maybe easier to hold off an attack.
Exactly, at least until Elbert arrived.
Makes sense as strategic retreat.
And while the British, they weren't just sitting back.
No, they were capitalizing on their advantage.
Brown's forces got a big boost when British regulars under the command of Major Mark Prevost showed up.
Okay.
And this brought their total strength to about 250 men.
So a considerable force.
It was, and importantly, their scouts. They were doing their job.
They found the Americans?
They found them. They located the American encampment on the night of May 16th, going into the 17th.
So right before the battle?
A night before the battle.
Okay, and what did they decide to do?
So here's where things get really interesting.
Oh.
The British, they weren't planning a straightforward assault.
Okay.
They were smarter than that.
So a more cunning plan.
Brown's Rangers and the Muskogee Indians, they set up a classic ambush.
An ambush?
Right along the route they expected Baker to take.
Right.
And at the same time, Prevost's regulars were advancing from the rear in 3 separate columns.
So they were going to be caught in the middle.
It was a well-coordinated trap.
A pincer movement.
Very effective and potentially devastating.
Sounds like it.
So the stage is set for this clash.
So what happens?
Around 9 o'clock in the morning,
May 17th.
May 17th, the trap is sprung.
Okay.
As Baker's men marched right into the kill zone,
Oh, no.
Brown's men opened fire with a surprise volley.
From how far away?
From about 50 yards.
That's close.
Very close range.
Devastating.
Absolutely. Imagine the chaos.
Yeah, total surprise.
And the sheer terror of being caught in this sudden onslaught.
So what did the Americans do?
Well, from the accounts we have, it seems like Baker's militia just completely fell apart.
They panicked.
They panicked, they broke ranks and scattered.
Trying to escape.
And as they fled, they ran straight into Prevost's advancing columns.
Oh. Right into their arms.
Right into their arms, and to make matters worse.
It gets worse.
Loyalist Rangers and Indians started popping out of the underbrush all around them.
Oh, so they're surrounded.
Completely surrounded. It was a total rout.
A disaster.
Now, reports on the casualties vary a bit. But generally, it seems like the Georgians lost somewhere between 4 and 8 killed,
Right.
about 9 wounded, and somewhere between 31 and 34 captured.
Okay. But you said it gets worse.
It does, and this is really grim.
What happened?
A lot of those who were taken prisoner
Captured soldiers?
were reportedly killed in cold blood by the Muskogee.
Oh, no.
It was an act of revenge
for that earlier killing.
for the death of their tribesmen during the horse theft incident.
Right.
And the British, they reported no casualties at all.
Wow.
It really shows you the brutal nature of this conflict,
It does.
particularly on the frontier.
Yeah, and the role of the indigenous allies.
Right, and the dangers of this cycle of revenge that was so common in these kinds of wars.
So what happened to Colonel Baker himself?
So Baker, he managed to escape.
He got away.
He did. He slipped into the swamps after his horse was either killed or taken from him.
So he survived the initial ambush, at least.
He did, but the other half of the American plan,
Elbert and the flotilla.
that's where the timing just completely fell apart for them.
Oh, no.
Elbert's ships were delayed by bad winds.
Bad luck.
Awful luck, and they didn't reach Amelia Island until May 18th.
The day after the
The
battle.
day after the battle.
Talk about bad timing.
Awful timing. So Elbert arrives on Amelia Island on May 19th.
Yeah.
And he's met by some of the survivors from Baker's command.
And they tell him the news.
To tell him what happened, and later even more reports come in confirming the killing of the captured soldiers.
So a devastating blow.
It must have been crushing.
What does Elbert do?
So faced with this news, and on top of that,
There's more.
he gets intelligence that Governor Tonin has sent a small fleet of British ships to oppose him.
Oh, so now there's a naval threat.
Yeah, although this fleet was temporarily blown offshore by bad weather.
Okay.
It was still a serious concern, and Elbert also realizes that his boats,
Which are probably shallow draft.
they were
Not meant for open ocean.
going to have a really hard time navigating the channels to the mainland, which were narrow and potentially defended.
So it's a tough situation.
It was, so he makes the tough call.
What does he do?
He decides to call off the entire invasion.
He abandons the mission.
He abandons it, and they set sail back to Savannah on May 26th.
So a complete failure for the Americans.
A complete failure.
Yeah.
So the second attempt to take East Florida ends in disaster.
And what about the British? How do they react to this victory?
Well, Brigadier General Augustine Prevost.
Who is that?
He was the top British officer in St. Augustine, and he was also Major Mark Prevost's older brother.
Okay, so the Major's brother.
He gave full credit to the British regulars
For the victory?
for the victory, but he was actually quite critical of Brown's Rangers and the Muskogee Indians.
Why is that?
He thought they should have pursued the remaining Patriot forces more aggressively.
So he wanted them to really press the attack.
Yeah, he didn't think they finished the job.
Interesting. So even in victory, there's some disagreement.
There often is, and he actually refused to fully compensate them for their services.
Really, why?
He argued that the Indians had gotten plundered,
Right.
and the Rangers had gotten cattle.
Okay.
But the regular soldiers, they had gotten nothing but hardship.
So he felt they deserved the reward.
And this little tidbit really gives you a glimpse into the sometimes complicated relationships between the different groups fighting on the British side.
Yeah. It wasn't always a smooth alliance.
Definitely. So did this British victory bring an end to the fighting in the region?
Well, you might think so,
You would think.
but it actually didn't.
It didn't. Thomas Brown and his loyalists, they kept raiding into Georgia.
They did not let up.
No, they did not. And this, of course, led to more calls for retaliation from the Patriot side.
So the cycle of violence continued.
It did, and in fact, Brown's success at Thomas Creek, it actually emboldened Governor Tonin.
How so?
He started pushing for a bigger British expedition
Oh, wow.
to try and take back control of all of Georgia.
So they wanted to go on the offensive.
Exactly. And the Americans, they didn't give up on East Florida entirely.
They tried again.
They tried again in 1778. General Robert Howe,
The same one from before.
the same guy, and John Houston, who was then the president of Georgia,
Okay.
they cooked up another invasion plan.
All right. Third time's the charm.
Maybe they thought, but just like the previous attempt,
It didn't go well.
it was plagued by internal squabbles over command.
Those leadership problems again.
They just couldn't get it together.
It seems to be a recurring issue.
It was, and the small number of American troops who did actually make it into Florida,
They were defeated.
they were defeated at the Battle of Alligator Bridge.
Okay.
So East Florida remained firmly under British control for quite a while.
They held on to it.
They did.
So this little battle in Florida has some significant consequences.
It did, in fact, later that same year in 1778, British forces sent down from New York.
Okay.
They captured Savannah,
Wow.
and they were soon joined by reinforcements from St. Augustine.
So they solidified their control.
And that pretty much reestablished British authority throughout Georgia.
Wow. So a turning point in the war in the South.
It really was, and it all stemmed from
This little battle in Florida,
this seemingly insignificant clash at Thomas Creek.
which wasn't so insignificant after all.
It wasn't. Now, here's something else to consider. The site of this battle.
Okay.
It's actually located within what's now Jacksonville's Thomas Creek Preserve,
Interesting.
which is part of the larger Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve.
So it's a protected area.
It is.
That's good.
And while the actual battlefield itself is pretty much undeveloped,
Right.
there is a highway marker nearby on U.S. Route 1.
So you can go visit it.
You can go see it. It commemorates the events of that day.
That's cool.
So even though it's not one of the most famous battles of the Revolution,
Right.
it's still remembered.
It is good.
So let's recap. What have we learned from this deep dive into the Battle of Thomas Creek?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that it was a decisive British victory.
Absolutely.
And it was the key event in the second failed American attempt to invade East Florida.
Right.
And it really highlights just how complex the war in the South was.
It does.
With all these different factions involved.
Yeah.
You had loyalists.
Yeah.
You had indigenous allies.
Right.
You had regular British
Yeah,
forces.
it was a very tangled web.
It was. And it also shows how important leadership is.
Absolutely.
And how internal conflicts can really undermine a military campaign,
Right.
no matter how good the plan is on paper.
And we can't forget the human cost of this battle.
Yeah.
You know, the ambush itself was brutal,
Brutal.
but the subsequent killing of the American prisoners by the Muskogee,
Right.
it's a stark reminder of the savagery that was often a part of this conflict,
It was a different time.
especially on the frontier,
Yes.
where the fighting was often very personal and very unforgiving.
Absolutely no holds barred.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up.
Yep.
We've spent this time exploring this one seemingly small battle in a relatively obscure part of Florida,
Right.
but these kinds of battles.
The ones that don't make it into the textbooks.
Exactly. They often played a huge role in shaping the course of the revolution,
They did.
particularly in specific regions.
Right.
And they really influenced the thinking of both sides.
Yeah, both strategically and tactically.
So what other seemingly minor events from this period
Yeah, what else is out there?
might hold hidden clues or insights into the larger conflict?
If we just dig a little deeper.
Exactly. It gives you something to ponder, doesn't it?
It does a lot to think about.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Battle of Thomas Creek.
My pleasure.
Always a pleasure to explore these forgotten corners of history.
Absolutely.
Until next time.
See you then.